the illusion of control, and the inner navigation system. We tend to move through life with a quiet but powerful assumption that we are in control of ourselves. That somewhere inside our head, behind our eyes, there is a conscious driver firmly holding the steering wheel, making decisions based on reason, intention, and free will. We identify with our thoughts, our plans, our moral judgments, and our choices, and we assume that these emerge directly from who we truly are. Yet, with even a small amount of honest introspection, this comforting image begins to crack. We notice impulses that appear before we decide, emotions that rise without permission, fears that sabotage intentions, and desires that contradict our values. The driver, it turns out, may not be fully in charge. A more accurate metaphor might be that of a complex navigation system. We experience only the interface, the glowing display that shows us a map, a direction, a reassuring sense of progress. Beneath that surface, however, runs a vast and intricate system of code, calculations, and hardware operations that we neither designed nor fully understand. Our conscious awareness is like the screen, useful, necessary, but profoundly limited. The real work happens elsewhere, in layers far below our immediate perception. And if we fail to learn how this system works, where it pulls us, what assumptions guide it, and how it reacts under stress, we risk drifting through life without direction, ending up in places we never consciously chose. This problem is not merely practical. It is existential. To misunderstand our own inner workings is to misunderstand who we are, why we suffer, and what might actually fulfill us. Many thinkers across history have sensed this gap between conscious intention and unconscious reality, but few explored it with the depth, courage, and personal risk of Carl Jung. Jung did not simply theorize about the unconscious from a safe intellectual distance. He turned inward, treating his own psyche as both subject and laboratory, and attempted to map the hidden systems that quietly govern human life. For Jung, the central problem of modern humanity was not a lack of intelligence or information, but a lack of self-knowledge. We live, he believed, dangerously over-identified with consciousness, what we think we know about ourselves, while remaining largely ignorant of the deeper, psychological forces that shape our behavior. This imbalance creates a kind of inner blindness. We assume our motives are rational when they are emotional, our beliefs are chosen when they are inherited, and our values are moral when they are compensatory reactions to unconscious conflict. The result is a life that feels oddly disconnected, productive but hollow, busy but aimless. What makes this especially dangerous is that the unconscious does not simply remain passive when ignored. It compensates. What is denied internally tends to appear externally through projections, irrational reactions, repeated mistakes, and destructive patterns. A person who refuses to acknowledge their aggression may experience the world as hostile. Someone who denies their vulnerability may become rigid and domineering. In this way, the navigation system continues to operate, but now blindly, rerouting us in response to pressures we refuse to see. Jung believed that many personal crises, social conflicts, and even historical catastrophes could be traced back to this fundamental psychological ignorance. Jung's interest in these hidden forces did not emerge in isolation. From a very early age, his inner life was unusually active and intense. He experienced his own mind as divided, layered, and mysterious long before he had the language to describe it. This sensitivity made him both deeply introspective and profoundly alienated. He did not simply think thoughts. He observed them. He did not merely feel emotions. He questioned where they came from. This early habit of inward observation would later become the foundation of his psychological work, but it also came at a cost. To look inward honestly is unsettling. It destabilizes the illusion of control that most people rely on for emotional safety. As Jung matured, he began to see that this illusion was not an accident but a defense. Conscious identity, the story we tell ourselves about who we are, exists to create coherence and stability. It filters experience, selects what fits, and pushes away what threatens the narrative. Without this filtering, we would be overwhelmed. But when the filter becomes absolute, when it refuses all contradiction, it turns into a prism. Jung's central insight was that psychological health does not come from strengthening the illusion of control, but from expanding awareness to include what lies beyond it. This expansion, however, is not intuitive. The unconscious does not speak in clear propositions or logical arguments. It communicates through images, symbols, emotions, dreams, fantasies, and sudden irrational reactions. To engage with it requires a different mode of understanding, one closer to interpretation than calculation. Jung believed that modern culture, with its obsession with rationality and external progress, had lost touch with this symbolic language. As a result, individuals were becoming increasingly fragmented, living outwardly successful lives while inwardly disconnected from meaning, the tragedy. In Jung's view is that this disconnection often goes unnoticed until it manifests as crisis, anxiety, depression, addiction, compulsive behavior, or a vague sense of emptiness are not merely malfunctions to be suppressed. They are signals. They indicate that the navigation system is struggling, that unconscious content is demanding recognition. To ignore these signals is to continue driving while the engine overheats. Trusting the dashboard lights instead of opening the hood, Jung's work begins precisely at this point of discomfort. Rather than asking how we can regain control in the conventional sense, he asks a more unsettling question. What if control itself is the wrong goal? What if psychological maturity consists not in domination of the inner world, but in relationship with it? This shift reframes the human task entirely. Life becomes less about forcing ourselves into predetermined ideals and more about discovering, integrating, and negotiating with the totality of what we are. This perspective challenges many modern assumptions. It undermines simplistic ideas of free will, moral purity, and linear self-improvement. It suggests that growth is not always upward, but often downward into confusion, contradiction, and shadow. Yet Jung believed that without this descent, there can be no real ascent. One cannot choose a meaningful destination without first understanding the forces that are already steering the journey. Thus, the exploration of the psyche is not a luxury or an abstract intellectual pursuit. It is a practical necessity. To know oneself in Jung's sense is to gradually move from being passively guided by an unseen system to consciously cooperating with it. Not mastery, but dialogue. Not certainty, but awareness. And it is this difficult, unsettling, but ultimately transformative project that Jung would dedicate his life to articulating in the next chapter. We will turn more directly to Jung himself, his life, his intellectual battles, his break with Freud, and the psychological crisis that forced him to confront the unconscious not as a theory, but as a lived reality. It is there, in the chaos of his own inner descent, that the architecture of his psychology truly begins to take shape. Crisis, separation, and the architecture of the psyche. To understand Jung's psychology, one must understand that it was not born purely from theory, but from necessity. His ideas were forged under pressure, intellectual, emotional, and existential. Unlike many thinkers who refine concepts at a safe distance from their own inner turmoil, Jung developed his psychology while standing inside the very forces he sought to describe. His theories were not abstractions imposed on the psyche. They were maps drawn while navigating it. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in the small Swiss village of Keswil, into a household marked by contradiction and quiet tension. His father was a rural Protestant pastor, educated, morally upright, but inwardly uncertain and spiritually disillusioned. His mother, by contrast, was emotionally volatile, deeply intuitive, and at times appeared psychologically distant. Even uncanny to the young Jung, she spoke of spirits, shifted suddenly between warmth and coldness, and seemed to inhabit a world partly invisible to others. For Jung, this early environment planted the seeds of a lifelong awareness that reality was layered, that beneath the surface of ordinary life existed something strange, symbolic and powerful. As a child, Jung was profoundly introverted and solitary. He spent long periods alone, immersed in imagination, fantasy, and observation. He watched adults closely, noticing inconsistencies between what they said and what they felt. Long before he could articulate it, Jung sensed that human beings were divided, that the persona presented to the world often masked deeper, unresolved inner lives. This sensitivity made him perceptive, but it also isolated him. School was a struggle. He experienced anxiety, fainting spells, and psychosomatic symptoms that nearly derailed his education. Yet, even these difficulties would later become psychologically meaningful to him, as early demonstrations of how the unconscious can intervene when the conscious personality is overwhelmed or misaligned. Eventually, Jung recovered his academic footing, driven partly by fear and partly by awakening ambition. He immersed himself in reading, particularly philosophy, theology, and the natural sciences. Although raised within a religious household, Jung gradually recognized that he could not accept inherited beliefs without direct experience. This tension between tradition and inner truth would become a defining theme of his life. He chose medicine as a path that could bridge scientific rigor with the mysteries of the human mind. Eventually specializing in psychiatry. After completing his medical training, Jung began working at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under the supervision of Eugene Bleuler, one of the most respected psychiatrists of the time. It was here that Jung first encountered severe mental illness not as an abstraction but as lived reality. He worked closely with patients suffering from psychosis and schizophrenia, observing that their delusions were not random nonsense, but often structured, symbolic, and emotionally charged. This observation planted a crucial idea, that even the most disturbed mental states might follow an inner logic, one rooted in unconscious meaning rather than conscious reason. It was during this period that Jung became acquainted with the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud's theories of repression, sexuality, and the unconscious offered a bold framework that challenged the moralistic and superficial psychology of the era. Jung was immediately captivated. When the two finally met in 1907, their conversation reportedly lasted more than 13 hours without interruption. It was the beginning of an intense intellectual and emotional bond. At first, Freud saw in Jung a kind of air, brilliant, energetic, and crucially, non-Jewish, which Freud believed would help psychoanalysis gain broader acceptance in a deeply anti-Semitic academic world. Jung, for his part, admired Freud's courage and originality. The relationship quickly took on the structure of a mentor and protege, or perhaps more accurately, a father and son. They analyzed each other's dreams, corresponded obsessively, and traveled together, presenting psychoanalysis to the world as a revolutionary, new science of the mind. Yet beneath this productive alliance lay an unavoidable tension. Freud's model of the psyche was fundamentally reductionist. He viewed psychological phenomena as ultimately traceable to biological drives, especially sexuality and aggression. Jung, however, increasingly sensed that this framework was too narrow. In his clinical work and personal experience, he encountered symbolic, material, mythological, religious, archetypal that could not be adequately explained by personal childhood trauma or repressed instinct alone. Where Freud emphasized causality, Jung began to see meaning. The break between them was slow, painful, and inevitable. Freud demanded loyalty to psychoanalysis as a unified doctrine, while Jung felt compelled to follow the evidence of his own experience. Their disagreements were not merely theoretical, they were existential. Freud feared that Jung's interest in myth, religion, and symbolism threatened the scientific credibility of psychoanalysis. Jung, on the other hand, felt suffocated by Freud's insistence on dogma. To Jung, a psychology that ignored the spiritual dimension of human life was incomplete. If not dishonest. By 1913, the relationship collapsed entirely. Jung resigned from his academic positions, distanced himself from the psychoanalytic movement, and entered what would become the most dangerous and transformative period of his life. Cut off from professional support and stripped of intellectual certainty, Jung found himself confronting the unconscious directly. What followed was not a theoretical exploration, but a psychological crisis that bordered on psychosis. For several years, Jung experienced powerful visions, dreams, and emotional upheavals. He feared, at times, that he was losing his sanity. Rather than resisting these experiences, however, he made a radical decision. he would descend into them consciously. He recorded his visions, dialogued with inner figures, and allowed symbolic images to unfold without prematurely interpreting or suppressing them. This process later documented in what became known as the Red Book was Jung's personal confrontation with the unconscious. This descent was not chaotic indulgence. Jung maintained his professional responsibilities, continued treating patients, and anchored himself in disciplined reflection. The key difference was that he no longer assumed consciousness was the sole authority. He treated the unconscious as an autonomous reality, one with its own intelligence, structure, and purpose. This experience shattered any remaining belief that the psyche could be fully controlled or explained by rational thought alone. Out of this crucible emerged Jung's mature model of the psyche. He came to understand the mind as a dynamic system composed of interacting layers, each with its own function. Consciousness, he argued, is only the surface. Beneath it lies the personal unconscious, containing forgotten memories, repressed emotions, and unrealized potential specific to the individual. Deeper still lies the collective unconscious, a vast, inherited psychological foundation shared by all humanity. This collective layer was Jung's most controversial contribution. He proposed that human beings are born not as blank slates, but with pre-existing psychological structures shaped by the cumulative experience of the species. These structures, archetypes, manifest as universal patterns of meaning: the mother, the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the wise old man. They appear in myths, religions, dreams, and art across cultures and epochs, often in strikingly similar forms. Archetypes, however, are not fixed images. They are tendencies, organizing principles that shape how we experience the world. When activated, they give emotional charge and symbolic depth to experience. A personal crisis, for example, may feel not merely unfortunate, but mythic, like a descent, a trial, or a death and rebirth. Jung believed that modern people still live within these ancient patterns, even if they no longer recognize them consciously. At the center of this entire system stands what Jung called the self, not the ego, but the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. The ego, which most people identify with, is merely the organizing center of consciousness. It provides continuity and identity, but it is not the whole person. Psychological suffering, Jung believed, arises when the ego mistakes itself for the self, when it refuses to acknowledge the deeper forces that surround and sustain it. Jung's own crisis convinced him that psychological development is not about eliminating conflict, but about integrating it. The psyche is not meant to be perfectly harmonious. It is meant to be whole. And wholeness includes contradiction, darkness, and uncertainty. Only by recognizing these elements, not repressing them, can an individual move toward genuine psychological maturity. In the next chapter, we will explore this process directly. Jung called it individuation, the lifelong task of becoming who one truly is. It is a path that demands radical honesty, confrontation with the shadow, and the courage to abandon comforting illusions. It is also, according to Jung, the only path that leads to meaning. Individuation, the shadow, and the cost of becoming whole. At the heart of Jung's psychology lies a single, demanding idea: that becoming whole is not the same as becoming good, successful, or socially admirable. Wholeness for Jung means completeness, not perfection. It means integrating all that one is, not merely what one wishes to be. This process, which Jung called individuation, is not a self-improvement project in the modern sense. It does not promise happiness, clarity, or control. Instead, it offers something far more unsettling and far more valuable: authenticity. Individuation begins with a simple but devastating realization that the ego is not the center of the psyche. Most people live as though it is. They identify almost entirely with their conscious self-image, their beliefs, values, ambitions, and moral judgments. This image provides stability and orientation, but it is also selective. It includes what feels acceptable and excludes what does not. Over time, this exclusion creates a growing internal imbalance. What is rejected does not disappear. It accumulates. Jung gave a name to this rejected material: the shadow. The shadow contains all the qualities, impulses, desires, and traits that the ego refuses to acknowledge as part of itself. Some of these elements are socially undesirable: aggression, envy, selfishness, cruelty. Others are simply incompatible with the identity one has constructed: vulnerability, dependence, sensitivity, ambition, or creativity. The shadow is not evil by definition. It is unknown, denied, and unintegrated. Its danger lies not in its existence, but in our refusal to see it. Most people attempt to deal with the shadow indirectly. Instead of recognizing unwanted traits in themselves, they project them onto others. The liar sees deception everywhere. The angry person experiences the world as hostile. The morally rigid individual becomes obsessed with the sins of others. Projection allows the ego to preserve its innocence, but at a steep cost. It distorts reality and externalizes inner conflict, turning psychological tension into interpersonal and social strife. Jung believed that a great deal of human suffering, both personal and collective, stems from this mechanism. When individuals refuse to confront their own darkness, it does not remain contained. It leaks outward, shaping relationships, institutions, and ideologies. History, in this sense, becomes a record not only of events, but of unintegrated shadows acting themselves out on a massive scale. Individuation requires a reversal of this process. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with the world?" one must ask, "What within me is reacting so strongly to this?" This question is not comfortable. It threatens the moral superiority of the ego and exposes its fragility. To encounter the shadow honestly is to realize that one is capable of far more than one would like to admit, both good and bad. It dissolves the fantasy of purity. This confrontation is not a single event, but a gradual descent. Jung often described it using spatial metaphors: going down, entering the basement, moving into darkness. Each honest examination of a thought, emotion, or behavior becomes a step downward. The deeper one goes, the more unsettling the discoveries become. Traits that were once unthinkable begin to appear plausible. Motives that were once denied begin to reveal themselves. This is why most people turn back. The ego experiences this descent as a threat to its existence, yet Jung insisted that avoidance is far more dangerous than confrontation. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. On the contrary, it gains autonomy. Repressed material tends to emerge in distorted forms: compulsions, addictions, irrational outbursts, depression, anxiety. What is not lived consciously is lived unconsciously, often with destructive consequences. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. Integral to this process is radical self-acceptance. This does not mean indulgence or justification. It means acknowledgement. To accept a trait is not to act it out blindly, but to recognize its presence and power. Only what is recognized can be regulated. Only what is admitted can be transformed. Denial, by contrast, leaves the individual at the mercy of forces they refuse to see. Individuation also involves confronting deeper internal opposites. Jung observed that every psyche contains contrasexual elements, qualities traditionally associated with the opposite gender. In men, he called this the anima. In women, the animus. These figures represent not biological sex, but psychological complementarity: emotion in the overly rational, logic in the overly emotional, assertiveness in the passive, receptivity in the domineering. When these elements are ignored, they often appear projected onto romantic partners, idealized or demonized, rather than integrated as inner capacities. As individuation progresses, the psyche gradually reorganizes itself around a different center. The ego does not disappear, but it relinquishes its claim to total authority. In its place emerges a more inclusive organizing principle: the self. The self represents the totality of the psyche, the conscious and unconscious held together in dynamic balance. Experiences of meaning, purpose, and inner coherence arise not from egoic success, but from alignment with this deeper center. Crucially, Jung did not believe that individuation leads to comfort. It often leads to greater responsibility, solitude, and inner tension. To live consciously is to live without the shelter of illusions. The individuated person cannot easily hide behind collective identities, moral absolutes, or social roles. They must take ownership of their inner life, including its contradictions. This is why individuation is rare, not because it is elitist, but because it is costly. Modern culture, Jung believed, actively resists this process. It rewards conformity, distraction, and external validation. It encourages people to identify with roles, labels, and ideologies rather than with their inner reality. In such a world, psychological suffering is often treated as a defect to be eliminated rather than a message to be understood. Medication, productivity, and positivity are offered where meaning and integration are required. Yet Jung was not pessimistic. He believed that the psyche has a natural tendency toward wholeness, much like the body has a tendency toward healing. Symptoms, dreams, and crises are not random malfunctions. They are attempts at self-regulation. When listened to rather than suppressed, they guide the individual toward neglected aspects of themselves. In this sense, suffering becomes meaningful not because it is good, but because it points beyond itself. Individuation, then, is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about becoming real. It is about narrowing the gap between who one appears to be and who one actually is. This process does not end. It unfolds over a lifetime, deepening rather than resolving tension. There is no final state of completion, only increasing honesty. In Jung's view, a life lived without this effort remains fundamentally incomplete, no matter how successful it appears from the outside. Such a life may function, but it does not truly belong to the individual living it. It is driven by unconscious forces, collective expectations, and inherited scripts. To individuate is to reclaim authorship, not by dominating the psyche, but by listening to it. Ultimately, Jung's work offers no comforting guarantees. It does not promise happiness, certainty, or salvation. What it offers instead is orientation, a way of understanding why we suffer, why we repeat patterns, and why meaning cannot be imposed from the outside. It suggests that the task of life is not to escape the darkness, but to bring light into it. Not to eliminate conflict, but to hold it consciously. To engage with one's inner navigation system is to accept that the journey will not be simple or safe. But it is also to accept that drifting blindly is far more dangerous. Individuation is the courage to descend, to integrate, and to live without false innocence. It is, in Jung's terms, the work of becoming whole.